Well, I imagine that some of you don't know me. Some of you do. Sorry about that. But I was 14 years old when our family moved back to Corvallis. My dad was going to vet school here in town, and I was a lukewarm Christian, about 8th grade. Francis Chan has a chapter in a book, or maybe it's a sermon title, that he calls Lukewarm and Loving It. And I was lukewarm. I wasn't really loving it. I wasn't really enjoying my walk with the Lord, being in the Word, devotional life, anything like that. But there was a revival going on in the youth group here at this church, and the high schools here in town had Bible studies going on. My older sister, Heather, that a lot of you know, was invited to one of those Bible studies, and her walk with Christ just was launched, and she invited me to come to that youth group, and I saw teenagers loving Jesus, worshiping him intimately, and having personal relationships with him. And I felt the Lord drawing me into that. And so I was 14 years old, and I remember the youth pastor kind of took me for a car ride, and we went to this tiny little house behind Corvallis High School, and there was Rob Verdine sitting out in his yard in a lawn chair with Susie, and Mark Troncalli was the youth pastor. He goes, "Rory, this is our pastor, Rob." And from that day on, Rob became a father in the faith to me and took me under his wing. And this might be surprising to you, but I was quite an awkward high schooler. And he just loved me and gave me opportunity to serve and took a risk with me, and just everything that he was doing, I wanted to be a part of. And that just became my high school years from my freshman year on, was just everything that was going on at the church I wanted to be a part of. And that began some ministry training for me. We moved away, and I just went under my pastor in Lakeview's wing as well. And then when I graduated, I wanted to go to the School of Ministry here, and did that, and it was great. And then I did a term of welding school at Lynn Benton. It was going to be like a tent making trade for me. And one term down, and Rob asked if I'd come on staff here at the church. And so I got to come be the high school pastor at the very church where my heart was set on fire for Jesus at. And so I was here for almost 8 years as the high school pastor, and got to be a part of everything from the Shintimony Senior Center, where we met in the late 90s. Anybody here in the Shintimony days? I know Eric and Diane, or yeah, anybody else? It's kind of hard to see out there. All right, over there, sweet. To to Crescent Valley. We were just driving by CV on the way here, and I've got 4 kids, and I'm like, that's where we did church, like forever, down to Westland Middle School years. Anybody here during those days? Yeah, awesome. And then I was here when the Lord gave us this property and got to be a part of the construction team here. And so this is definitely home away from home, and I'm just so glad to be here. Rob reached out a few months ago and asked me to teach, and I had just a sermon in mind. We just started teaching Genesis on Wednesday nights, and I've never taught through Genesis before, so it's been rocking my world, like learning about creation. Like, I didn't know that was like a controversial issue. And Cain and Abel, like, who did Cain marry if he only had? I could tell you if I was able, but I just had to fit that joke somewhere in there. And but I had a Cain and Abel sermon on my heart and my mind. It seemed fitting for Thanksgiving season. And then Rob was like, "Hey, would you think about teaching about Simon of Cyrene carrying the Lord's cross?" It's like, that's like one verse. What am I saying? One whole verse. And you could also teach on the wailing daughters of Jerusalem following, and that's 3 more verses for you. Like, it's not much. But he knew if he gave me too much, we'd be here forever. And I have a strict timeline today. And so Rob has been teaching through Luke, and I'm going to pick up where he left off and teach a few measly little verses from verses 26 through 31 of Luke 23. And you've been studying the trial of Jesus and how he was arrested in the garden. It's an incredible thing to get on Google Earth if you've ever been to Jerusalem and get out your little tracking tool and track where Jesus would have gone on his final night there, from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane to Caiaphas' house to the Praetorium to Herod's palace, back to Pilate, and then out to Golgotha. It's something about 2.5 miles that Jesus walked that night. But you've been studying the mock trials, the false trials, the lawfare that had been going on against Jesus there. And I'm just guessing, I haven't listened to Rob's sermons, but I'm guessing you picked up where Pilate had declared Jesus to be innocent and that he'd found no reason to put him to death or anything, so we'll flog him and let him go. And the chant of the crowd became so strong that Jesus be crucified, and it just speaks of that the noise from the tumult really overpowered, that they were insistent, and the chief priests prevailed. And so 24 says, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. And then just very sobering words, but he delivered Jesus to their will. And so that gets us to our text today regarding Simon of Cyrene becoming a conscript for a moment by the Roman army. You might have heard about the young man who received summons to be drafted as a conscript into the army, and he was so nervous and just knew that he couldn't shake it in the army, so he told his best friend, come over here, I need you to knock my teeth out so that the army won't receive me. And so his friend was like, this is nuts, man, what are you talking, I just can't go in the army, you've got to do something, knock my teeth out, go ahead. And so his friend did what he dreamed of doing for all those years they were friends, and went through the brutal process of knocking the teeth out of this guy. And next day, he reported down to the army office and met up with his friend later, and his friend said, well, how'd it go? And the damaged friend said, turns out they didn't want me, I had flat feet. These are the jokes, people. Simon of Cyrene, standing on the curb, as it was, watching a crowd goes by, was conscripted to be a servant of the Romans. As 26 says, as they led Jesus away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. So just picking out and apart the phrase and the sentences, as they led him away, speaking of Jesus, a little bit about me. I'm a cowboy and I have a ranching ministry in Prineville and was raised on a ranch and have broke horses and work with horses, and our kids have steers now, and so we get them ready for 4-H, and if you've ever done that, you've got to halter break a steer, you know, and what we call, when we've halter broke those animals, we call it that we're leading them, you know, that they are now under our mastery. They are now in submission to us as we lead those animals around. And it just struck me as I was reading this, now they're leading Jesus. They're leading him away. It seems that he is broke or broken. As a beast would be led away, they take him away from the Praetorium where he has just been wounded and beaten, stripped and whipped. The crown of thorns laid upon him. He's taken rods to the face, and he is damaged. He is hurting. John's gospel is the only gospel that doesn't mention Simon carrying the cross, not so much focusing on that moment. It's reasonable to believe that Jesus was in good health as the night began. And I don't know if you walk much, but just walking, it's really good physical exercise. I got a border collie, McNabb, in the last month, and that animal needs to be walked and needs some miles put on her. And so just been walking. I trek for Nepal and hike in Nepal and just walking, and really good exercise. Wears you out. Even 2 miles, you start feeling it in the hips and the different muscles. Just walking alone, Jesus may have felt by, the early morning hours, not your normal hiking hours, but the phlegorum, being flogged by the Romans, no doubt put pain and took strength. The great loss of blood that Jesus endured, no doubt put him into a weakened condition. And so one of the Romans apparently, or a few of them, knew that it was time, as it was common, to then pick somebody to carry the cross. They pick Simon. They lay hold of a certain man, or the language speaks of them grasping him. As if I didn't have enough going on in my life, a new jiu-jitsu gym opened up in Prineville, and I always wanted to do it. So I signed up a month ago, and I've had about, 5 or 6 classes now. I'm still walking upright, which is good. But they're teaching us how to grasp your opponent and the different grips and holds and grabbing the gis and things like that. So I'm really having fun with my 8-year-old and my 10-year-old at bedtime. I'm like, you're not going anywhere, and hooking in and grabbing a hold of their jammies and choking them out real quick. It's just no big deal. I imagine that the Roman soldiers had been trained on how to grasp or how to force, how to compel Simon of Cyrene. It was Matthew's gospel that uses that word compelled. Him they compelled to bear his cross. The word compelled makes me think of in the book of Acts when Titus was, they were trying to force Titus to become circumcised, to be legalistic and pharisaical in his faith. And it says, not even Titus was compelled to be circumcised. So kind of forcing, they couldn't even force it on Titus, but they were forcing this task upon Simon. Him they compelled. And the language speaks of requisition Simon to carry the cross. I appreciated the CSB version. As they led him away, they seized Simon, a Cyrenian who was coming in from the country, and they laid the cross on him to carry behind Jesus. So compelling, seized, requiesced, perhaps with the tip of a spear in the back, Simon was chosen, though probably against his will, to do such a task. So a few things about Simon. Simon was a Cyrenian, the ancient city of Cyrene, and this is where you get to do your own homework on your phone there. You can just type in Google, Cyrene, and a map will pop right up. And you'll see it's on the north tip of Africa, the north coast of Libya, and that some 1,300 kilometers, I didn't do the math to figure out what that is in miles. I was like, these are Corvallis people. They work for HP and OSU. They know how to do the math. But some 1,300 kilometers that he traveled to get to Jerusalem for Passover from the north coast of Africa. Cyrene had a huge Jewish population, so he, along with probably his family and friends and community, were there in Jerusalem for the Passover. He was a Cyrenian who was coming in from the country. And this is when my ears perked up when I was reading that Simon was a country boy. He drove a 4-wheel drive, knew how to fish and hunt, and probably had a dip in his lip, if I'm honest with you. I mean, he wasn't a Christian yet at this point, so But Simon was a country boy coming in from the country. Maybe he was just staying out in the country around Jerusalem. Maybe that was where he was getting his lodging. But it may play into just a little bit of how he was able to be a servant here. Leon Morris says, it's been conjectured, though, that Simon was won that day by bearing of him whose cross he carried. So there's something about this story that it is a great single verse that Rob gave me to teach on here, that we gather from church history, but also from this scripture, that Simon became a believer this day, a believer in Jesus. In Mark 15:21, Mark's account of this is that then they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by to bear his cross. So when Peter is writing to the Romans, he references Simon, and he essentially says, you'll know which Simon I'm talking about when I bring up his sons. I'm going to bring up his sons, Alexander and Rufus. It was their dad that carried the cross that day. So Peter was writing to the Romans through the secretary of John Mark there in Mark's gospel. But then when Paul was writing to the Romans in Romans 16:13, he's closing out the letters, mentioning some saints and some snakes while he says so long at the close of the chapter. And a couple of the saints that he mentions is when he says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. And so we have this guy who comes up to the Romans a couple of times, or with the Romans. His name is Rufus. Now to us, it just might be the name, a classic name for our favorite pooch, We're Rufus, Somehow I think that's a dog's name. I could be totally wrong. You're like, what is he talking about? It's a dog's name. It's a dog's name. Don't act like you don't know that. All right. But Rufus, it's a name meaning red or red hair. He's someone that's known and spoken of twice in the New Testament. His brother Alexander, some speculate that Alexander had a role in the church or may have been martyred. History is pretty silent on those details. But Rufus is mentioned twice. And then also Paul has these special words in Romans 16, his mother and mine. And so within the generation after the incident, Paul writes of Rufus, Alexander, Mrs. Simon, right? Their mom, Simon's wife, who apparently in a chapter in Romans that has to deal with great missionary hospitality, this mother is mentioned as being like a mother, like a caretaker, like a provider who refreshed Paul the Apostle's heart. So it's just incredible to see, if you didn't know any better, you just read the one verse that's mentioned in Matthew or Mark or Luke of Simon, and you'd probably gloss over that he had a couple kids named Rufus and Alexander, and you just move on in your quiet time, right? And move on in reading through the word. But there's stuff we can glean from just the New Testament as well as church history, of what may have really transpired that day on the Via Dolorosa, the road to the cross. Paul calls Rufus chosen in the Lord, or eminent in the Lord. That means outstanding. And Paul may be referring to that his dad was chosen. A Cyrenian from Libya, from North Africa, happens to be in Jerusalem on Passover in the most incredible day in human history when God draped in flesh, lays his life down for the sins of the world. And this African is chosen out of a crowd, compelled to carry a cross. Boy, if that doesn't show dad and mom and sons were chosen or eminent or outstanding in the Lord, I don't know what does. And I wonder how many of us in this room have relatives who have walked the walk for the Lord in such a way that you and your siblings and your cousins are now walking in the Lord because of a moment like the Via Dolorosa where grandpa or great-grandpa was compelled to follow Jesus and to carry the cross of Christ. I'm a little bit of a history buff, and I write a quarterly article for the Central Oregonian. I've been compelled to write an article for the I never enjoy it until it's done. And then I like that I got to do it. You know, it is a great honor and privilege for the Faith Page article. But whenever I'm wondering what to write, a lot of times the Lord brings up, in just crazy ways, family members of mine from history who loved Jesus. And so just kind of by happenstance, research had been done for a trip that my mom took to Ireland. And so the research was passed along to me, and I discovered that I have a great-great-great-grandpa from the Revolutionary War period named Tidance Lane. And Tidance Lane, he was saved through the preaching ministry of a guy named Shubal Stearns during the Second Great Awakening in Georgia. Shubal Stearns was born again through the ministry of George Whitefield. And so there's just incredible writing that's been done by myself in my blog that I have. I copied someone else's writings and put it in my own blog. By the way, I have a blog. You didn't know if they made those anymore. Well, I make them. One. And it's amazing. But you can read all my stories there, commissionfuel.org. Anyways, Tidance Lane got saved from the ministry of Shubal Stearns, an incredible story of how he was born again in an antagonistic home to the Baptists. But he became the first pastor of the first church in Tennessee. And in Gray, Tennessee, there's a church that's still there today called Buffalo Ridge Baptist Church. It's incredibly healthy. It's the oldest church in the state, and it's very similar to my church and to your church, very mission-focused, loves local body fellowship. We don't meet unless we eat, and there's a lot of pictures of them having potlucks. And I just love the story of Tidance Lane, who during the Revolutionary War called the pioneers to the muster of the Over Mountain Men and led the pioneers to fight against the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain in North Carolina, where they won. And some say it turned the tide of the Revolutionary War, forcing Cornwallis towards surrender. I mean, that's what I say anyways. But love the story of Tidance Lane. And when I found out about this, just happenstance, I have a son named Titus, and I have a daughter named Lainey, which both speak of comfort and the road to the cross is what I named my kids after. And his name's Tidance Lane. So I love that story of my great-great-grandpa. I have another relative I've researched named John C. Crumbaugh, who lived in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just before the Civil War where Gettysburg took place. And he was known to be a man of character and integrity. And there's this old book of a picture of him with his graduating class of Gettysburg University. And you can tell by the scarf that he has wrapped around a protruding Adam's apple that we're related. It's a showstopper every time. And it's written about him, what a love he had for the Lord. And if his life wasn't cut short at the age of 27 by like a stomach cancer, how he would have impacted Pennsylvania for the kingdom of God. I love that story. I love that through my mom's line, I'm related to the last chief of the Omaha Indians, Joseph LaFleche. And it's just an incredible story of how he had a number of daughters. One was the first female Native American doctor in the country. She's in the Washington, D.C. Medical Hall of Fame. Another was a writer who traveled with Longfellow and championed Native American causes, all these things. But one thing I love about studying the story of Grandpa Chief Joseph LaFleche was that he became a believer in Jesus Christ and met with the pastor of the Black Hills Presbyterian Church regularly for extended conversations where he eventually became a believer in Jesus and then really encouraged the tribe to become Christians as well. And his daughters would become servants in the church there in Nebraska. Love these stories, but if you were to just all sit around a table and share the stories of your relatives who knew Jesus and because of their walk with the Lord, I trust that's why I'm walking with the Lord today. I bet they prayed for their lineage that would come. You might have a Brian Regan moment, if you know Brian Regan, the comedian, where he says, imagine going to a dinner with Neil Armstrong, who walked on the moon. And you're telling all about your exploits and all the great things that you've done, and he's just sitting there patiently eating, waiting to just drop on the table that, well, he walked on the moon. And so when I share about, oh, isn't it incredible, these guys and what they did for the Lord, Alexander and Rufus are just eating away going, my dad carried the cross for Jesus. No big deal, but he's got the slivers to prove it, you know. But that day and the walk that he had with the Lord, it was about a mile or so, changed his family's trajectory and really church history, that the church in Rome would have known these young men and their mother. We don't know what happened to Dad, and so Simon of Cyrene bore the cross, felt its weight. Being a farm boy, and some of you may appreciate this, we used railroad ties as fence posts and corner braces. Anybody ever had the privilege of working with railroad ties? Just soaked in tar or whatever it is, or some chemical, and just nitty gritty, you know? And you dig the big hole and you pack it and you slam it in. Those posts can weigh anywhere to 150 to 300 pounds. And they always reminded me of the cross when I would carry them. And if you study, that's believed that the cross of Christ weighed about 300 pounds. Some think that Jesus would have only been carrying the crossbar or the patibulum, which weighed about 100 pounds or so. But rough and rugged, as we like to sing of the old rugged cross, Jesus packed it a little ways with that poor back of his, wounded from the stripes. And Simon then picked it up, probably also bloodied from Christ, feeling its weight, feeling its grit, probably getting some scrapes and splinters from the journey that day. And as he carried the cross, somehow something happened in what he observed, something similar maybe to the thieves on the cross, that in observing Jesus's demeanor, they went from mocking to one of them being a partaker of Jesus. And something that changed Simon's life. Luke 9:23 through 25, Jesus says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And I wonder if when Simon and Rufus and Alexander and Mama Simon, I'm going to call her for lack of a name, I wonder if when they read Luke, if anyone wants to follow me, let him take up his cross. And probably around their table, they would say, remember when Dad took up the cross? right? Remember when Dad took up the cross of Christ and carried it that distance? Someone had thought, wouldn't it be tremendous if we could follow every person that was at Golgotha that day and see what happened in their life? I'm sure that reading Jesus' statements about carrying the cross would have resounded and impacted and created poignant memories for Simon and his family, to where now they carry the cross. They lay down their lives in response to a life that was laid down for theirs. Dad Simon was carrying the cross as a servant of Jesus, but it was Jesus that was being the servant to Simon that day. As he had every opportunity to be victor and every right to be the master. But as Mark 10:45 tells us, it was that day that he laid down his life as a ransom for many, and he became the servant. And as Simon watched Jesus be the real servant, he was forever changed. My buddy Josh Bryant is the pastor at Calvary Chapel in Burns, and we both have ranching ministries, and we go out and cowboy and just get to share the Lord with people that are out in the desert places and in the forests. And he has his ministry over there in Harney County, and ours is in Crook County, and sometimes we get to meet up in the mountains between us and rope together and do work together. But he has a saying, Josh Bryant does, when it comes to our walk with the Lord, he says, and it's in his Burns accent, so you have to forgive me. He says, I've been ruined. I've been ruined. Everyone say that. I've been ruined. There you go. Someone did it. Or I've been ruined. And we talk about that as pastors, like, I've been ruined. I'll never be able to go back and live the life I had for myself by God's grace, right? No matter what. Man, ministry can be hard. There's times I consider quitting and resigning and going and doing something else. But then I just know, I know that God has called me to be a part of a local church, so I'll go to a church. And I know that God has called me to use the gifts that he's given me to serve, and so I'll serve. And I know that I have to be faithful in serving. And then, oh my goodness, the next thing you know, I'm faithful in serving in the little things, and then the Lord's made me a leader, and here I am again. I've been ruined. I've been ruined. And I think that day, Simon was ruined. Whatever he did in Cyrene, whatever he was before that day, how could he ever go back? I've been ruined in understanding that half the world's population has never heard the gospel of Jesus. And God's put me and our church on a path where we trek in Nepal into the Tibetan Buddhist areas of the Himalayas and just expend great finances and energy to tell Tibetan Buddhists of the saving grace of God, that they might know him and enjoy him and tell others of him as well. And once I heard about the unreached people groups of the deserts and the jungles and the mountains that have never heard about Jesus, I've been ruined. I have to go every year to tell people about Jesus in these unreached people groups. Our family, it's been a couple years now that we have put effort and energy into the foster care and adopt work that happens. And after we had a little girl that we love so much and witnessed what happened in her life, and we had a couple other foster kids as well, our heart was broken for the hurting kids in the foster system. We've gone to court and we've fought for kids. We have had retribution against us by the state. We've had punishment and had to take 27 hours more classes just to put us in our place, and where everything in us wants to say, we're done with you, stupid system. I've been ruined. There are little children that need a mom and a dad to care for them in the scariest moments of their life. How could I ever go back? Have you ever been ruined before? Simon was ruined this day. He could never, how could I ever go back? goes back home or to their little rented house or wherever it was that they were staying out in the country and sees his wife and wondering how the trip into town went, getting some, pomegranates or maybe some falafels or whatever they were bringing home for lunch. How was the trip? And what do you have all over your shirt? And what are those splinters? And why is your gown torn? And why is there like blood on you? What? And he says, it was an interesting trip to town today. You won't believe what I witnessed. And I'm just telling you right now, honey, I'll never be the same. We'll never be the same. Hebrews 13:11 says, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore, let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. In a roundabout way, it's speaking of Simon. And in a roundabout way, it's speaking of you and me. Jesus went outside the gates of Jerusalem and suffered as a sacrifice to wash away our sins. And anyone that sees that gets to carry their cross as well and join him and partake in the sufferings of Christ, Paul says in Philippians, that we might also partake of his resurrection. And the context of Hebrews here is that we've got to give up our past systems that we've rested in for any sort of self-righteousness or to make us who we think we ought to be. We got to lay it all down and just come to the foot of the cross and let Jesus speak into us who we are. We got to lay it all down and bear the same reproach, giving it all up as Jesus did for us. And so we have a country boy, and now we have some city girls. 50 years ago on Friday, my mom, who was a physician's daughter from the city, went out to the ranch, a ranch in Klamath Falls, to get some manure for her dad's garden. And there out on the I.F. Rodgers and Sons ranch, a really handsome wrestler shoveled manure while she held the bag. And it was love at first sight. A country boy and a city girl. Who knows if this is how Simon's prodigy continued, but probably not. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. Speaks of them singing a dirge or singing a lament. So there's this noisy demonstration of deep grief, but Jesus turned to them and said, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Even in this moment, Jesus isn't focused on himself. He's focused on others around him and their repentance, and that they would know him as the resurrection and the life. And he goes on to prophesy over them, for indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and the breast which never nursed. And they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. And so he's kind of dual prophesying. He's speaking of what's going to happen in Rome in just about 30, 40 years. And that those women who have children, they're going to be under the siege of the Romans. And in 2017, I went to Israel with Rob. I've been a few times, but Rob's voice was hurting him. He asked me to go with him to help him speak. And I was in my hotel room in Jerusalem, and I decided to pick up Josephus's book, The War of the Jews. And I read about the siege of Jerusalem while I was in Jerusalem, and it made me tremble, the horror that the people of Israel went through. And I never realized that there were 3 different gangs in Jerusalem among the Jews that would torment and torture their own people to steal the food from their own people while the Romans were outside sieging Jerusalem. And when you study it, the Romans were actually kind of fair-minded in how they were trying to kind of put the Jews in their place under their foot. Titus Vespasian really didn't want to do a lot of what had happened there, but because of the gangs of Jerusalem, it ended up becoming way worse than it should have been. But Jesus prophesied over it, and when you study it, oh my goodness, how sad it is. The children starving, the cannibalism, the mothers, cannibalizing their children. It happened in the Old Testament as well. Horrible, horrible things. And Jesus essentially says, it's going to be like that. And it's going to be better if you never had children because of what's going to happen. Because of this moment, you want to kill the Christ, there are going to be consequences for it. And it has a fulfillment in 70 AD. It has a fulfillment in Revelation chapter 6, where we see the day of the Lord and the second coming and what leads up to that. And the kings of the earth crying out for the mountains to fall on them. And then this final phrase, for if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? Essentially saying, if this is what they're doing to somebody who was innocent, that never hurt a fly, that was just here to serve people, and they let their pride and their ego get the best of them, they're going to do this to me right here at Golgotha, at this cross. Imagine what they'll do to the unrighteous people, what they'll do to the zealots, and then further, what a just God will do to anybody that crucifies the Lord of glory. And so those are the words that he has for the daughters of Jerusalem. And I just want to close with a little story. One of my great-grandfathers, I'm sure you're not bored of my stories yet, he married Rosalie LaFlèche, the chief's daughter. His name was Ed Farley. And in the Civil War, Ed Farley was, there we go. Ed Farley was General Lew Wallace's stable boy. And Lew Wallace, if you know, Lew Wallace was a great general in the Civil War, had some blunders, became the governor of New Mexico, tried to get Billy the Kid off the hook, helped charge Abraham Lincoln's assassinators, right? But then he became the ambassador to Jordan and went over to Jordan. And while he was in Jordan, Lew Wallace began to research Christianity, and taking trips into Israel, he became intrigued with what it might have been like to be alive at the time of Jesus, and he wrote the book Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. And in writing his book, he became a Christian and a follower of Jesus. And I just thought I would read, the worship team's going to come up in just a minute, and I thought I would read, I find it intriguing in the story, what it would have been like to just have been a normal person there living in Israel and watching Jesus go around and do his thing. It was kind of like The Chosen before The Chosen came out, you know. And the story's about Judah Ben-Hur, who was a Roman zealot, or rather he was a Jewish zealot who wanted to push away the Roman army. And he was hoping that this Jesus would be the one, the Messiah who was coming to help fight away the Romans. And so the whole story is about him coming to terms that that might not be what God's plan is with this person. He may be coming to build a bigger kingdom and a different kingdom by different means. And so this is picking up towards the end of the book of Ben-Hur. And it says, the next morning about the second hour, 2 men rode full speed to the doors of Ben-Hur's tents, and dismounting, asked to see him. He was not yet risen, but gave directions for their admission. Peace to you, brethren, he said, for they were of his Galileans and trusted officers. Will you be seated? Nay, the senior replied bluntly. To sit and be at ease is to let the Nazarene die. Rise, son of Judah, and go with us. The judgment's been given. The tree of the cross is already at Golgotha. Ben-Hur stared at them. The cross was all he could do for the moment say. They took him last night and tried him, the man continued. At dawn, they led him before Pilate. Twice the Roman denied his guilt. Twice he refused to give him over. At last he washed his hands and said, "Be it upon you then." And they answered, who answered? They, the priests and the people. "His blood be upon us and our children. Let us go, brethren. Let us to Golgotha." They passed through excited crowds to people going south like themselves. All the country north of the city seemed aroused in emotion, hearing that the procession with the condemned might be met with somewhere near the great white towers left by Herod. The three friends rode thither, passing round southeast of Acra in the valley below the Poot of Hezekiah. That says pool. I had a thing on my screen. Also the Poot of Hezekiah. Passageway against the multitude became impossible, and there they were compelled to dismount and take shelter behind the corner of a house and wait. The waiting was as if they were on a river bank watching a flood go by, for such the people seemed. There are certain chapters in the first book of this story which were written to give the reader an idea of the composition of the Jewish nationality as it was the time of Christ. They were also written in anticipation of this hour and scene, so that he who was read with them with attention can now see all Ben-Hur saw of the going to the crucifixion, a rare and wonderful sight. Half an hour, the flood surged by Ben-Hur and his companions within arm's reach, incessant, undiminished. At the end of the time, he could have said, "I've seen all the castes of Jerusalem, all the sects of Judea, all the tribes of Israel, and all the nationalities of earth represented by them. The Libyan Jew went by, and the Jew of Egypt, and the Jew from the Rhine. In short, Jews from all east countries, and all west countries, and all islands within commercial connection. They went by on foot, on horseback, on camels, on litters and chariots, and with an infinite variety of costumes, yet with the same marvelous similitude of features which today particularize the children of Israel. Tried as they have been by climates and modes of life, they went by speaking all known tongues, for by that means only were they distinguishable group by group. They went by in haste, eager, anxious, crowding, all to behold one poor Nazarene die, a felon between felons. These were the many, but they were not all. Born among with the stream were thousands, not Jews, thousands hating and despising them, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Syrians, Africans, Egyptians, Easterners, so that studying the Mass, it seemed the whole world was to be represented, and in that sense present at the crucifixion. The going was singularly quiet. A hoof stroke upon a rock, the glide and rattle of revolving wheels, voices in conversation, and now and then a calling voice were all the sounds heard above which men make haste to see some dreadful sight, some sudden wreck or ruin or calamity of war. And by such signs Ben-Hur judged that these were the strangers in the city come up to the Passover, who'd had no part in the trial of the Nazarene and might be his friends. At length, from the direction of the great towers, Ben-Hur heard, at first faint in the distance, a shout of many men. "Hark, they're coming now," said one of his friends. The people in the street halted to hear, but as the cry rang over the heads, they looked at each other and in shuddering silence moved along. Meantime, the flood poured along, if anything more densely than before, and the shouting came nearer, shrill up in the air, hoarse among the earth and cruel. At last the procession was up. "See," said Ben-Hur bitterly, "that which comes now is Jerusalem." The advance was a procession of an army of boys, hooting and screaming, "The King of the Jews! Room, room for the King of the Jews!" A band of legionnaires fully armed followed next, marching in sturdy indifference, the glory of burnished brats about them. The while, then came the Nazarene. He was nearly dead. Every few steps he staggered as if he would fall. A stained gown, badly torn, hung from his shoulders over a seamless undertunic. His bare feet left red splotches upon the stones. An inscription on a board was tied to his neck. A crown of thorns had been crushed hard down upon his head, making cruel wounds from which streams of blood, now dry and blackened, had run over his face and neck. The long hair hair, tangled in the thorns, was clotted thick. The skin where it had been seen was ghastly white. His hands were tied before him. Back somewhere in the city, he had fallen exhausted under the transverse beams of the cross, which, as a condemned person, custom required him to bear to the place of execution. Now a countryman carried the burden in his stead. 4 soldiers went with him as a guard against the mob, who sometimes nevertheless broke through and struck him with sticks and spit on him. Yet no sound escaped him, neither remonstrance nor groan, nor did he look up until he was nearly in front of the house, sheltering Ben-Hur and his friends, all of whom were moved with quick compassion. Esther clung to her father, and he, strong of will as he, trembled. Belshazzar fell down speechless. Even Ben-Hur cried out, "Oh, my God, my God." Then, as if he divined their feelings or heard the exclamation, the Nazarene turned his wan face towards the party and looked at them each one, so that they carried the look in memory through life. They could see he was thinking of them, not himself, and the dying eyes gave them the blessing he was not permitted to speak. "Where are thy legions, son of Hur?" asked Simonides, aroused. "Hannes can tell thee better than I." "What, faithless? All but these 2? Then all is lost, and this good man must die." 2 other men succeeded the Nazarene bearing crossbeams. "Who are these?" Ben-Hur asked of the Galileans. "Thieves appointed to die with the Nazarene," they replied. Next in the procession stalked a mitred figure clad in all golden vestments after the high priest. Policemen from the temple curtained him round about, and after him in order strode the Sanhedrin and a long army of priests, the latter in their plain white garments, overwrapped by abnets of many folds and gorgeous colors. "The son-in-law of Hannes," said Ben-Hur in a low voice. "Caiaphas, I've seen him," Simonides replied, adding after a pause during which he thoughtfully watched the haughty pontiff. "And now I'm convinced with such assurance as proceeds from clear enlightenment of the Spirit, with absolute assurance, now I know that he first goes yonder with the inscription about his neck is that which the inscription proclaims him, King of the Jews. A common man, an impostor, a felon was never thus waited upon. For look, here are the nations, Jerusalem, Israel. Here is the ephod, here the blue robe with its fringe and purple pomegranates and golden bells, not seen in the street since the day Judah went out to meet the Maccabeans. Proof all that this Nazarene is king. Would I rise and go after him? I see some women there, and they are weeping. Who are they? Following the pointing of her hand, the party beheld 4 women in tears. One of them leaned upon the arm of a man of aspect not unlike the Nazarenes. Presently Ben-Hur answered, "The man is the disciple whom the Nazarene loves, the best of all. She who leans upon his arm is Mary, the master's mother. The others are friendly women of Galilee." This is the moment to strike. A blow well given now would not merely disperse the mob and set the Nazarene free, it would be a trumpet call to Israel and precipitate the long dreamt of war for freedom. The opportunity was going. The minutes were bearing it away. And if lost, God of Abraham, was there nothing to be done? Nothing? That instant, a party of Galileans caught his eye. He rushed through the press and overtook them. "Follow me," he said. "I would have speech with you." The men obeyed him, and when they were under shelter of the house, he spoke again. "You are of those who took my swords and agreed to strike for freedom. And the king who's coming, you have the swords now, and now is the time to strike with them. Go, look everywhere and find our brethren and tell them to meet me at the tree of the cross. Make ready for the Nazarene. Haste all and tell them haste all of you. Nay, stand not so. The Nazarene is the king, and freedom dies with him." They looked at him respectfully, but did not move. "Hear you?" he asked. Then one of them replied, "Son of Judah." By the name they knew him. "Son of Judah, it's you who are deceived, not we or our brethren who have your swords. The Nazarene is not the king, neither he or the spirit of the king." We're almost done, by the way. "We were with him when he came into Jerusalem. We saw him in the temple. He failed himself and us in Israel. At the gate beautiful, he turned his back upon God and refused the throne of David. He's not king, and Galilee is not with him. He shall die the death. But hear you, son of Judah, we have your swords, and we're ready now to draw them and strike for freedom. And so is Galilee. Be it for freedom, O son of Judah, for freedom. And we will meet you at the tree of the cross." The sovereign moment of his life was upon Ben-Hur. Could he have taken the offer and said the word? History might have been other than it is, but then it would have been history ordered by men, not God. something that never was and never will be. A confusion fell upon him. He knew not how, though afterwards he attributed it to the Nazarene. For when the Nazarene was risen, he understood the death was necessary to faith in the resurrection, without which Christianity would be an empty husk. Will you guys stand with me? I know that's a lot. It was more than I meant for it to be. It went so fast when I was reading it yesterday. But interesting to have another perspective of someone that was like, we got to save this guy. When really that's why this guy came. He came to die the death of a servant on a Roman tree, bearing the curse to save Simon of Cyrene and Alexander and Rufus and their mom. He died the death on the cross to save you and me. And it's Thanksgiving weekend, and we can just close down today with thankful hearts that history went the way that it did. And we can understand the death on the cross all the more as we understand the resurrection from the tomb, without which Christianity would be an empty husk. It's not an empty husk. Christianity is truth and life and light, as we sang earlier today. And so just a few verses that we had today, but we can learn so much from Simon. A life that was changed in one moment, where his life was interrupted and he was compelled to be a servant of the servants. A day that he was ruined for the kingdom. And there's just a lot to just consider as we close down, that if Simon would learn to carry the cross for the rest of his life beyond that day, he would be a follower of Jesus. And he would teach his sons to carry their crosses, to despise the shame, to be partakers also of the resurrection, to crucify sin daily, to embrace the emblem that saved their souls. We too, 2,000 years later, can do the same. With thankful hearts and gratitude, embrace the cross of Christ. Purpose in our hearts to carry that emblem, that representation of death to self and life in the Spirit. In just a minute, we're going to take communion together, and you're going to come up and take the elements, and you're going to grab bread, and it's going to remind you of the flesh of Jesus that took those beatings and was whipped and bore the shame. A friend of mine would say, the bread represents the body of Jesus that absorbed the wrath of God towards sinners. And as you would take the bread into yourself and eating it, you're thanking the Lord and remembering in your inner person, Lord, you bore the wrath that was towards me. And we take the cup together, we remember the blood that was spilled that day, blood that atones and takes away our sin and satisfies the wrath of God towards sinners. We drink it, we take it into ourselves, symbolizing in our inner man in faith, we believe this was for us. And maybe just today afresh you would say, and so Lord, I like myself with Simon and with Alexander and with Rufus and with their mother. I too am a partaker of what happened at the cross that day. And I want to live for you, and I want to train my kids up to live for you and to be leaders for you. And maybe even today you would say, Lord, my life's been ruined for you. I could never go back. Whatever it is, whether I'm cleaning or discipling or singing or witnessing or practical works or whatever it may be, Lord, my life is to be spent for you. And so today I just begin afresh spending it for you. During this next song, just come forward, take those elements and rejoice in the cross and cling to the cross and thank the Lord for the cross as it atoned for sin and led to the empty tomb that gives us resurrection life as well. Let's go ahead and partake together. Come up during this next song.